Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening of Wednesday, September 7th, 2022. I welcome you on behalf of the Association of Pittsburgh Priests, who are the sponsors for this evening's program. We are a diocesan-wide organization that through our call of common baptism, we are ordained and non-ordained men and women responding to our baptismal call to be prophetic and to live the gospel and live the spirit of Vatican II. Our topic this evening is where do we go from here? Our speakers, we're honored to have two speakers this evening, Trisha Bruce, who is a sociologist with the University of Notre Dame, Center for the Study of Religion and Society, and Emily Riemer-Berry, Associate Professor, Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of San Diego. You'll get a little more information about them a little bit later. I'd like to express my appreciation to the behind-the-scenes people on our team, Ethan Mann, Paula Nettleship, Jim Ruck, and I understand that even Gretchen Jerzik will also be a backup. She's out of town, but she will be one of our backups. I need to remind you that the session will be recorded. It will be available later on our APP website and on the new APP YouTube. So look for that. I'd like to have the screen put up about our process this evening. We'll have an opening prayer, presentations by each of them, but first Trisha and then Emily. And then we'll have an open forum of questions and answers. We ask that you put your questions in the chat or use the reaction function on your laptop that will give the hand signal that you want to be recognized. Participants will be muted during the whole presentation and prayers. Before I introduce our person who will be offering our prayer, I just want to encourage us that because this issue is so volatile, both in our church and society, let us pray that we might be good listeners of one another, less critical. If we have concerns, we ask questions of clarity and not of judgment, and so that we can discover a future of dealing with this issue of abortion. So without ado, I want to introduce Andrea, who will give us our opening prayer. Andrea?
Sure. Begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Loving God, turn my eyes to the other that I may see each as you see me, with an innate dignity that transcends all earthly status. Help me to see the other as your beloved child eternally. Turn my ears to the other, that I may hear their cries as you hear mine, with a compassion and tenderness that draws me close in the midst of suffering. Help me to hear the other as your beloved child eternally. Turn my mind to the other, that I may come to understand them as you understand me, struggling to find meaning and wholeness in a world that's fragmented, and your light in a world that's dimmed. Help me to understand the other as your beloved child eternally. Turn my hands to the other, that I may serve them as you serve me, with a touch that cleanses, heals, feeds, and reassures. Help me to serve the other as your beloved child eternally. Loving God, turn my life to the other, that I may live in solidarity with them, and that they may cease to be other. I ask all of this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Father.
Thank you, Andrea. I'd like to introduce Marlene Millick, who will introduce our first speaker. Marlene.
Thank you. How does one introduce someone with as many accomplishments as Dr. Trisha Bruce? I don't know, but I'll try. Trisha's a sociologist with expertise in religion, Catholicism, abortion attitudes, social movements, and social change. The author of many books, including Parish and Place, Faithful Revolution, and our forthcoming book, How Americans Understand Abortion. She has co-authored several books and has authored articles for Time Magazine, Science Advances, the Wall Street Journal, Religions, Journal for the American Academy of Religions, and Review of Religious Research. She's an affiliate at the University of Notre Dame Center for the Study of Religion and Society. Her newest accolade is chair of the American Sociological Association Region Section and council member for the Association for the Sociology of Religion. And she is a writing coach for the Academic Writing Club and has been honored with many book awards, community awards, and research grants. She resides in Knoxville, Tennessee, and with all the above, she still finds time to spend with Bruce and her 10 and 12-year-old. We're now honored to hear and learn from Trisha Bruce.
Thank you so much, Marlene. And it is just an absolute pleasure to be here with you all in this virtual space. And it's been wonderful to get to know you a little bit already. And I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation. And it is a very important one and a very timely one. And I particularly appreciate that I am here also with Dr. Riemer-Berry, given that we both bring a slightly different vantage point to this conversation. And I'm looking forward to the dialogue ahead. I'm going to share my screen. All right, and I believe you can see a PowerPoint now, I hope. Great, thank you. All right, now, of course, we heard a moment ago the title, Abortion, Where Do We Go From Here? But I also mentioned that I am a sociologist, and we heard that from Marlene as well, and sociologists are often better at telling us where we are than they are at telling us where we're going or where we ought to go. So I actually want to start the conversation there, which is to say, with regard to abortion, and in particular, Americans' attitudes on abortion, where are we now? I come to this from my research with a team of sociologists over the course of nearly a year that resulted in this report, which is available online for free. You can Google it by the title. I'll include a link at the end, or it's linked to my website as well. There are some other publications also. This particular report stemmed from a study of 217 Americans, in-depth interviews with a random subset of Americans throughout the United States. It was supported by the McGrath Institute for Church Life of the University of Notre Dame, and I worked with a team of interviewers on this study. Now, what made this particularly unique are a few things. One is when we looked at the landscape of trying to understand where Americans sit vis-a-vis the issue of abortion, which is a question that many, of course, are raising now, what we found on the data side was very limited. And in particular, much of the data was limited to surveys and the kinds of questions that limit your responses to close-ended categories. And I think we've all had the experience in surveys, as useful as they are, where we want to write in the margins or write something else or explain ourselves. And what happens is that, we're not able to fully explain our attitudes, and in particular for an issue that is as complex as abortion. And moreover, that kind of data, again, while useful, it reifies certain stories and frames about abortion that turn out to be somewhat untrue in terms of how Americans actually think about it. And so we set out then to go deeper. I'll just mention briefly on methods. You could read more about it in the report, but the interviewees that were included in this study did not initially know that the topic of the study was abortion. We felt that this was important because we didn't want to pre-bake the study, as it were, with folks who were particularly opinionated on the issue. Rather, we said it was about a social issue. We sent out 2,500 letters to a random set of addresses across 6 different regions in the US. The folks who received those letters then filled out an online pre-screener of sorts that said, ask them things like their marital status, their religion, their political party, their ideology, things that we know often correlate with abortion attitudes. And then from there, we built our sample. But we sat face to face. Literally, this was pre-pandemic, 2019, with 217 Americans to ask them in depth how they thought and felt about abortion. The other piece that I'm going to bring into this conversation is the piece that you all have had a direct impact on, which is the statement that the Association of Pittsburgh Priests put together in light of the changing landscape legally of abortion in the United States. You, of course, can see the headline there. The call, which I think is a laudable call to develop a new pastoral and spiritual approach regarding abortion and the culture of life. So what I will do in the time ahead is actually pull some of the statements from this statement that you all put together and help to shed light on some of those in light of the data and the interviews, the in-depth conversations we had with this random set, diverse set of Americans across the United States. And the hope here is that by showing us where we are, it can help also to shed light on where we are going from here. One of the statements that I want to really pull out from the statement that you all put together, marked by your logo here, is this one. Many Catholics, like other Americans, find terms like pro-life or pro-choice to be divisive, inadequate, and misleading. And I will say at the outset that this is absolutely the case and absolutely what we found. I'll focus especially here during our time together on Catholics, but interestingly, Catholics actually look like Americans overall in many ways in terms of their positions on abortion morally and legally. The one big caveat and exception I'll add to that, which I'll bring up later, is that it does matter if you're looking at self-identified Catholics overall or Catholics who also are active in the church, and in particular, Catholics who attend Mass. So if you break up those two groups, Catholics who attend Mass regularly and Catholics who don't attend Mass as regularly, they do look different. But as a general bucket, in fact, Americans overall and Catholics look similar, and that is true on this point. We heard Americans over and over again tell us that those labels felt uncomfortable. They felt sometimes filled with hypocrisy. We asked them to describe the ways in which those particular labels captured perceptions of groups or beliefs or people. And as you can imagine, there's a range of responses, many of which are not entirely positive for those terms in particular. We wanted to offer people a little bit of flexibility then around this. Again, I said from the outset that we entered this as qualitative interviewers rather than survey methodologists. So we wanted to give people choices. So one of the things that we did as a way to prompt this conversation was say, well, if it's not an either or, then we asked for one, what label would you give yourself? What would you offer? And then also, if it were more of a scale, where would you put yourself on that scale? So I'm going to show you a picture then. This is for Americans overall. And the question here was, if there were a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 was the most pro-choice and 10 was the most pro-life, where would you put yourself? And what we observed and what you'll see in this graphic depiction here is that there is indeed some clustering at the edges. So of course, some people feel more adamantly that that label does in fact describe them and their views. But a lot of people fall somewhere in between. In fact, most Americans fall somewhere in between. So they put some kind of buffer, whether it be a 2 or 3, or we had a large number of 5s and 6s landing somewhere in the middle. So people were eager for some alternative way to express a commitment to what they understood to be both the commitments of a pro-life camp, as it were, and a pro-choice camp. Let me give you some specific examples. These 3 examples of interviewees are all Catholic. So I'll introduce first Steve, Steve is a Catholic who he was born and raised Catholic. He actually went on to attend Catholic schools. He even worked for his parish and for the diocese. But later on, and I won't give you Steve's full story, but I will just say that Steve had some struggles with personnel and on the diocesan front and work-wise, and he felt ultimately that he didn't feel as at home in the church anymore. And I mentioned this just to say that Steve, at this point in his life, is not attending mass as regularly as he once was. But when we asked him this question about, where do you put yourself on the scale and how do you identify? He said, well, I'm a 10. I mean, I'm really pro-life. So here's someone who on paper then seems like, oh, well, the label fits. But I know this is a lot of text, so I don't expect you to read all of it. But let me just show you and point out, a couple of things. One, he says, well, I know I would be a 10, but, at the same time, how can you, as a Catholic or someone who holds this view, how can you also refute what he calls the individuality and the agency of a woman to make decisions for herself and her body? We heard a lot of Catholics and others sort of grapple with these things and raise them both as values that they held dearly. He also mentions here in his own Catholic upbringing and Catholic theology, he makes references to these statements of "let your conscience be your guide." We know, of course, ordinary Americans are not theologians. Ordinary Americans don't necessarily have the kind of training that some even in this Zoom room have, but they do remember things, and the formation from church is strong. So here he talks about this balance. Yes, I am both very pro-life. I'm a 10. And yet also, we need to have a way to have this conversation that incorporates these other values. Kimberly, likewise, is a Catholic. Her mass attendance is somewhat sporadic at this point, but she identifies as a Catholic. And she says also for her, she's kind of somewhere in between. And we had many Americans tell us something like this: I'm in the middle. And the interesting thing about this is that a lot of the folks who said that they were in the middle would also say things like, well, they would apologize for it, like, oh, I'm so sorry, I don't fit this. Or we had one person say, I'm going to break your dissertation, to one of our grad student interviewers, because they thought, oh, I'm the one. Well, they're not the one. Kimberly and Minnie fell in between. She also is someone who said, well, the labels don't really fit the issue at all. And she said, well, I could chant for both. I could march for both. Of course, by the way, most ordinary Americans are not involved in social movements. They're not activists engaged in the issue of abortion. Perhaps some of that is changing in this landscape of legal changes at this point. But when we sat down face to face, that was not on their radar and something that they did regularly, in part because many of them felt like they didn't fit and that they wouldn't find a home in, quote unquote, either side. Kimberly also mentioned something that many of our interviewees mentioned, which is that politics make me angry. Here she has some harsh words for those who are in office, but she doesn't trust politicians. And so this was sort of a strong sentiment that came across also. And a third Catholic to mention with regard to these labels is Ida. Ida is a Black Catholic who is very immersed, involved in the church. She is someone who, not only is she there every Sunday, she's there nearly every day of the week. She's highly involved. At the same time, when we asked her this question, she said, well, I'm pro-choice. And she knows that may not align with some of her other identities. Not only is she Catholic, but she's also a Republican. And so she talks about here, she says, oh, I know that may horrify people. But she raises the point that many Americans and many Catholics raised when they talked about what these labels signify and mean. And I heard this in your statement also, which is that sometimes pro-life is interpreted and translated into a very limited definition that considers things like pregnancy and abortion or early care of an infant, but then afterwards does little to support the life through the life course and the dignity for all. The way Ida puts it is life is all the way from 1 to 10, and we forget about 2 to 10. We spend so much time talking about number 1. She also raises the sentiment that is in fact true data-wise. At the end here, she says, there's a lot of Catholics who are in the situation that I am. There is a lot of us. In fact, there are a lot of us. Part of what I take away from this particular set of conversations vis-a-vis the labels and thinking about your own statement is that these terms, we continue to use them, but I think that every time they get used, they should be exercised with extreme caution because they don't mean the same thing to everyone. And that vastness of definition causes some real confusion and messiness. And it also causes people to point out things like hypocrisy. Now, I know it's kind of a high bar to ask or invite the possibility of not using them at all. But I think it's something that might be worth considering just because the terms have taken on a meaning that no longer reflects perhaps the true intention of what they are. Worth recognizing also in terms of where do we go from here, that Catholics, like all Americans, hold this range of positions that in fact don't always align with church teaching. We heard Ida as one example of someone who's very cognizant of this level of clash and dissent. We have quite a bit of data also around things like contraception or other points of disagreement, or what sociologist Michelle Dillon calls non-assent to some of the teaching of the church. And so Catholics, again, Mass is going to matter here too, but many Catholics do not fit neatly or align with those teachings of the church. Another thing I wanted to point out is that we have lots of Catholics have a very loose and less than clear articulation of what the church's position on abortion is. Now, I point this out as a sociologist who says, again, what is, not what should be, and we didn't go into our interviews providing a clear articulation of what any given religious theological position on the issue of abortion is. But ordinary Americans, including Catholics, by and large, don't have it, and many of them actually, there's an eagerness for that, because paired with the reticence towards politics and towards talking about abortion at all means that they have very little opportunity to actually learn and engage with some of those teachings. So there's very much an opportunity to share. And then also I mentioned this point about support also in light of breaking the binary. So what might it mean then to break apart this perception of abortion attitudes as falling into two camps? And part of what it means is beginning to cut through to say that, in fact, notions of agency, and I would hesitate to use notions of individualism, and perhaps Emily and our dialogue will go there later. But to the extent that there are sort of spaces for that in these conversations, rather than talking about a quote unquote pro-life position in the exclusion of women's agency. Another statement that I want to pull out from your statement that our data speak to is this well-written one here that says, these are likely to be the same women, and this is talking about women who have abortions. These are likely to be the same women who also mother other children, sit in the pews next to us, or who used to sit in the pews next to us until they no longer felt welcome. They may be our sisters, cousins, aunts, mothers, or grandmothers. Again, this is wholly correct and wholly reflected in the data that we gathered through our interview project. I'll mention that on average, and this statistic was mentioned in the paper as well, that by the age of 45, approximately a quarter of US women will have had an abortion. That same statistic was reflected in our random sample. Again, this was a random sample. They didn't know that it was about abortion. We didn't know who these people were. And yet it was almost to a percentage point, a quarter of the women in our study disclosed an abortion. Now that's based on disclosure. It's possible that others did not disclose, but we were really struck by how honest people were in the space of the interview conversation, because we guaranteed them confidentiality. We weren't, tying confine this to the names. In fact, I should mention the names that I used earlier. Those are pseudonyms. Those are not their real names. And so the protection of that safe space to be able to share, I think for many people, open up an opportunity to share in ways that they may not otherwise. We had many women disclose abortions that they had not ever told their parents, or that they rarely told their friends or family members or others in their life. If we look at the numbers in our interview study, and here's again introducing a few numbers here, but I'll bring it back to the qualitative data on the next slide. But let me just tell you the takeaway, since your eyes may glaze over with the stats. But let me tell you what's important here. Okay, first of all, some of the language. So core Catholics, by that we mean Catholics who attend Mass pretty regularly. So in this case, monthly or more. And then peripheral Catholics attend less than monthly. I also included in here, I combined them. So all Catholics, if you just want to look at that third line alone, you can. I also looked at former Catholics. So folks who said they were once Catholic, no longer Catholic. And then the interviewees who have never been Catholic, and then all the non-Catholics. So you can compare all the Catholics to all the non-Catholics if you'd like. But what we're looking at here is the percentage among each of those groups that have personal abortion experience. That's that first column. And then in the second column, the percentage of interviewees who knew someone personally who has had an abortion. So let's look at the third line, the third row, which is all Catholics. So we'll just look at them together. So among all Catholics, 13% of women, Catholic women that we interviewed, had experienced an abortion. So that number is slightly less than that quarter of the overall American population, which also says something about, or do they remain in the church? Just like your statement mentioned, perhaps some have left. And I think you see this in part with the low percentage of peripheral Catholics. So it seems to me, and this is a hypothesis, but so among the Catholics who attend less regularly, it seems like someone might be inclined to stay and participate or leave entirely. They're less likely to hang on to the identity and not actually participate, because perhaps that stigma of the abortion experience is enough to compel them to leave. We had many stories of rejection in the church, really difficult stories to hear and read in the transcript subsequently, stories not only related to disclosures of pregnancies and situations that weren't fully supported, or unwed pregnancies, but folks who had been fired from their positions, and different, one woman, for example, talked about how her sister was fired as a teacher who taught at a Catholic school upon becoming pregnant. Others who had very difficult stories related to divorce and abuse, and just a lot of hardship in the church. But in any case, so the people who are in the pews with you do in fact also have abortion histories. And so we can't pretend that abortion is something that does not touch Catholics who are in the pews. The other thing that's really important to point out is that the vast majority of people know someone personally who has had an abortion. So overall, among our interviewees, it was roughly 3/4 among ordinary Americans know someone personally who's had an abortion. Sometimes we know somebody and don't realize we know somebody. So because of the non-disclosure issue, in this case, these are, we asked, do you know someone personally? And they said yes. So this is when they knew. But these are sisters, daughters, neighbors, co-workers, so in this way, abortion is very much a personal issue. And this is absolutely how Americans talk about it, how they think about it. So when we look at this landscape of abortion in America now and how it's changing, people are reading it through the lens of personal experience, whether their own or people they know. Not only abortion experience, but things like miscarriages, infertility. It's the stories, it's the emotion of those experiences. That's where people go first and foremost. To share just a couple stories here, a few stories here. Again, these are 3 different Catholics, and these are 3 different Catholic women who disclosed a prior abortion in our interviews. These 3, the first one is Maeve, the second one is Daniela, and the third one is Patsy. Again, these are pseudonyms. But what you can begin to hear in each of these are part of these themes, and this came out in the statement too, around it being an abortion decision that was driven and contextualized by other factors, like, for example, feeling too young, feeling like they didn't have a relationship that was supportive or one that was leading towards marriage, financially struggling, feeling like there was moral angst around it, but not a whole lot of other options. The second interviewee talks about how she feels like it was the right decision for her, but she continues to play through this in her head and tries to sort of talk through and justify it. Again, these are all Catholic women. The third one really wishes that it would have been illegal at the time so that she would not have had her abortion. So I think about these women now too, and these stories that are in other Americans and other Catholics' heads as they're, again, looking at this changing legal landscape and where to house morality and legality around this issue and what the law looks like in terms of, some talk about it in a way to say that the law guides people to moral decisions, and others have a different view of it. But abortion is very personal. So in this case, I think part of what it means to have an informed response to the issue of abortion in terms of where we go from here has to do with, one, relatability. So the sense that it is about stories, it's about relationships, and it's about us as much as it is about them. Those who have abortions are not an other. They are absolutely among the people we know and are. Situating, I believe Emily may go into this a little bit too, but thinking about who is the abortion patient and who is the perception of the abortion patient. And these things don't always align. So one quick example is that the vast majority of abortion patients, people who have abortions, are already mothers. That is not the conceit that people bring to this issue. They think of someone as not yet ready. They think of someone who will be a mother, but is not yet a mother. But empirically, that is not the case. Stigma, of course, a big player here, and in particular, the stigma that circles around religion and the Catholic Church, and stories of felt rejection or lack of support or inability to talk about experiences. And I mentioned this word root also just to say that abortion decisions and the ways that people talk about pregnancy decisions and these stories are very much rooted in other contextual factors about I mentioned contraception, but also about education, class, marriage, women's and men's roles, access to jobs, notions of the good life. So it is about so much more than this single decision about a pregnancy outcome. And I think part of that creates an inroad to have a conversation about abortion that may not otherwise be had, which is where I'll go with my last point and the last quote that I'll raise from your statement here, which is, we need a culture of life that lives in our faith communities. And I was really struck by this statement, and I think it's a charge, right? It's a call to, I don't want to say call to arms, but it is a call to create something that perhaps is partially there, but not entirely there. Now, our data speak to this also in the sense that people don't talk about the issue of abortion, and in fact feel very uncomfortable doing so. So when we ask them, do you remember the last time you had a conversation with somebody about abortion? Again, these are pulling from Catholics in particular, just as some examples. A lot of people just simply said, no, I don't remember, I haven't had one, I've never talked about this issue. Others say, yeah, maybe a few years ago, they're scratching their head, maybe with a family member, maybe with my mom, maybe with my husband. Again, these are Catholics, and mass attendance is going to vary. But the question that I keep coming back to, looking at all this data, is where do these conversations happen, and how is there a way to create a level of comfort around it, particularly in a context now where across 50 different states, there are 50 different sets of very messy conversations around what the law should look like, what morality is or should be. And yet people have a stated fear of having those conversations. The last stats I'll put up in front of you is just to say that mass does matter. The takeaway I want to give you here is that mass Mass, attending Mass, being an active Catholic, does in fact impact someone's views on abortion, both morally and legally. It matters for how they think about it. So I raise that here to say that, in fact, it does matter. It connects it, and there's something about that participatory factor that shapes views. And so I think looking forward to how do communities create this space for conversation. Is it at Mass? Is it elsewhere? But one way or another, it needs to happen in terms of if we're thinking about collectively, where do we go from here? I mentioned the full report is online. More than happy to engage conversations in the Q&A and follow up from here. Also looking forward to Emily's remarks as well. Thank you so much.
It's really an honor to be with all of you tonight. For those who have experienced abortion and are looking for spaces of non-judgmental support and care, these are two organizations that I recommend. I believe that the church could learn from the way that these organizations model accompaniment and care instead of messages rooted in shame and blame. I'm going to leave this slide up as I thank the organizers of tonight's session for the invitation to join you. Special thanks to Ethan, Paula, Sister Barbara, Andrea, Marlene, Jane, Jim, John, to everyone who planned tonight's event. I'm very grateful to be able to join you. And Trisha, I'm really grateful to be able to share this space with you tonight. Trisha has already done a superb job of walking us through the data from her study and helping us to see the important contributions of sociologists to our understanding of abortion discourse and a way forward. My training is different than Trisha's, but it is complementary. As Marlene explained, I'm a Catholic feminist theologian. I'm deeply indebted to the trailblazing work of women religious and feminist theologians who have modeled what it means to demonstrate creative fidelity to the church. My work follows a feminist method, broadly speaking, so criticism, retrieval, and reconstruction. And I raise up and problematize the patriarchy and sexism of the church's institutional structure and of some church teachings. I want to be clear that when I speak tonight, I speak from the church, not for the church. Catholic magisterial teachings argue that direct contraception is morally illicit. Catholic magisterial teachings defend the position that marriage can only be between a man and a woman, and that the genital sexual expression of love is only appropriate in a sacramental marriage. Catholic magisterial teachings argue that direct abortion is morally illicit. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has also advocated that these teachings of the church be adopted in US law. They oppose contraception access and lobbied against the healthcare mandate. They oppose same-sex marriage and lobbied against laws legalizing same-sex marriage. And the bishops have lobbied for legal protections for unborn children. The bishops say that they are not partisan, but that the continued injustice of abortion remains the preeminent priority for them in their lobbying efforts. I remain distressed that women's experiences have not adequately shaped US Catholic approaches to abortion discourse and to healthcare ethics. I advocate for a reproductive justice framework that sees inherent value in both maternal life and fetal life. I reject any moral absolutism that seems to value fetal life over maternal life. Sometimes these two lives, that is, the life of the mother and the life of the fetus or the embryo, can indeed be in conflict with each other in the real world. And I think it's important that we name that as a reality that some people face. I believe that coerced pregnancy should not be described as a moral good, and that the only ethical way to save unborn children is to create a climate in which the pregnant person chooses from her own free will to carry her pregnancy to term. While I do have a goal of reducing the number of abortions, I do not approve of any methods that remove the decision-making from the pregnant person. Instead, I believe in creating robust social, structural, and spiritual supports for pregnant people. I also believe that we need a new moral vocabulary to account for the disvalue of fetal death that is sometimes necessary in some particular cases. Whether we describe that as non-moral evil or tragedy, I think we need a better vocabulary to acknowledge the real grief that people experience when fetal demise is a reality. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a physician, I'm a theologian, but in order to do my job, I need to try my best to understand the shifting landscape in our legal and medical world on this issue. Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health is the Supreme Court decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. Justice Samuel Alito wrote the majority opinion and argues that the US Constitution does not guarantee a right to an abortion even before viability. That is, the time in which the fetus is reasonably expected to be able to live outside the womb, which is variable, but about 24 weeks. Alito argues that the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, does not enumerate a right to abortion. Alito does not find evidence that abortion is deeply rooted in this nation's history and tradition, or that it is implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. The Dobbs ruling returns abortion regulations to the states. So right now there's considerable variability in abortion laws state to state. According to the Guttmacher Institute, abortion bans are in effect in 11 states, with restrictions growing in other states. Members of the pro-life community and leaders of the Catholic Church celebrated the Dobbs decision publicly. They said, and I quote, "The injustice of abortion has loosened its grip on our nation's constitution." I suspect that many people in this meeting know someone who has been impacted by the Dobbs ruling already. For those working in emergency rooms, pharmacies, family practice clinics, or OBGYN clinics, your experiences may even be more immediate. The two main impacts that I worry about are unnecessary suffering for pregnant people and confusion for physicians and nurses and other staff in medical facilities. Regarding the first, unnecessary suffering, it's been widely reported that medications that some women need when they experience miscarriage are the same medications that are used to terminate pregnancy. Some pharmacies have stopped carrying mifepristone, misoprostol, and methotrexate, and others have created new hurdles for women bleeding from miscarriage. There is no medical reason for this. It's the result of a team of lawyers deciding that corporate liability in some cases matters more than women's access to medical treatment. But surely this is not something that Catholics should be celebrating. Further, abortion care was already difficult for many patients to access before Dobbs because many states had significant restrictions in place, from waiting periods to ultrasound and counseling requirements to laws about the facilities and the providers. Now more women are seeking to travel out of state for abortion care, and many others report their inability to afford to do so. In states with recently enacted abortion bans, doctors have struggled to determine which procedures are legal in the new post-Dobbs climate. This has been especially difficult for women with wanted pregnancies who faced difficult complications. A patient in Texas died from a concealed placental abruption when the medical team thought that they could not intervene because a fetal heart rate was detected. Also in Texas, a physician reported that a pregnant patient died of aortic aneurysm which was declared non-emergency until the pregnant patient was unconscious. In a case in Louisiana, a patient was forced to endure a difficult labor and delivery after her water broke at 16 weeks because the hospital's lawyers decided that the patient's request for a dilation and evacuation procedure would put the hospital at risk, even though the fetus was sure to die as it was before viability. After delivery, the patient began hemorrhaging and lost close to a liter of blood. Her physician explained, "The trigger bands will make treating pregnant women who are already suffering from complications even harder." A physician in Central Texas was instructed not to treat an ectopic pregnancy until a rupture had occurred, according to media reports. And one doctor said the idea of having to wait until pregnant patients get sick is just counterintuitive to what we train to do as physicians. That was Dr. Nisha Verma, an OBGYN in hearings on Capitol Hill on July 19th of this year. A further concern for all of us who care about human dignity and social justice is that abortion bans disproportionately disadvantage poor women and women of color. Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, BIPOC patients already have poor health outcomes because of structural barriers. Michelle Goodwin's groundbreaking book, Policing the Womb, describes how fetal protection laws have led to horrific results that have included, in some cases, women giving birth while shackled in leg irons, medical staff sharing confidential patient records with prosecutors and serving as snitches to report pregnant women's substance abuse, pregnant women forced to deliver via cesarean without their consent, pregnant women refused chemotherapy to treat cancer, and women prosecuted even though the loss they experienced was miscarriage or stillbirth. Healthcare disparities in the US are racialized, and I suggest that these should be treated as a preeminent priority for all people of faith. So let's be clear about the disproportionate impacts to poor women and people of color. A study conducted before Dobbs showed that half of patients seeking abortion could not pay the cost themselves, and that the cost of the procedure was only one portion of the total cost, which also included transportation, lost wages, childcare expenses, and other travel-related costs. 14% reported that they delayed or did not pay rent in order to cover the cost of their abortion. 16% delayed or did not pay for food in order to cover the cost of their abortion, and 30% delayed or did not pay for utilities or other bills in order to pay for their abortion. The USCCB says that their vision of society is one in which legal protection of unborn life is accompanied by profound care for mothers and their children. But for a long time, I fear that they've focused on legal protection of unborn life without giving enough attention to profound care for mothers and their children. We need more attention to the actual support that women and children need in order to have healthy pregnancies, safe deliveries, and happy childhood. What exactly are we doing as a country, as a church, to offer assistance to women who cannot afford parenthood? Affordable housing, just wages, affordable childcare, flexible work hours, paid medical leave, free healthcare. Infant daycare in my county costs $12,900 to $19,500 a year per child. A recent news story reported that there are not enough slots in after-school programs for children who returned to school last week. So the unlucky parents whose children did not get a spot need to be able to pick up their children at 2 p.m. on Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, and noon on Wednesdays. That doesn't sound like my work schedule. I don't know about yours. We should not talk about women who terminate their pregnancies as if they are evil or stupid or both. The reality is that women who have abortions make thoughtful decisions based on all of the information all around them, and they deserve our compassion and our non-judgmental support, and they really just need practical help. Reproductive justice advocates have been saying for decades that justice for pregnant women requires affordable health care for all, attention to racial disparities in maternal and infant mortality, affordable childcare, equal pay for working women, family and medical leave and bonding policies, comprehensive sex education, an end to human trafficking, an end to sexual violence, real conversations about consent and hookup culture, among the many other social goods and moral issues that we need to focus on. Many of these are common ground and nonpartisan issues that I really think we could all get behind and make priorities. When Diane Foster Green and her research team asked women, what were some of the reasons that you decided to have an abortion? Answers were grouped into the following categories, and those are on the slide here. Not financially prepared, it's not the right time for a baby, partner-related reasons, the needs to focus on other children, interferes with future opportunities, not emotionally or mentally prepared, health-related reasons, wants a better life for the baby than she can provide, not independent or mature enough to have a baby, influences from family or friends, doesn't want a baby or to place the baby up for adoption. I'm going to share from scholar activist Loretta Ross, who explains, in abortion debates of privacy, women's rights, fetuses, and the law, the isolation of abortion from other social issues like violence against women fails to incorporate the intersecting issues that actually determine how a pregnant woman makes the decision to have a baby. She may base her decision on available health care, housing, violence, age, finances, her partner, education, immigration status, or other considerations. Combinations of social and economic issues matter. That's a big quote. So I think this is a big takeaway for us today in terms of where do we go from here, building these systems of justice and systems of support. Combinations of social and economic issues matter. Parents have to figure out how to pay the bills. We need to think about reproduction with greater recognition of the social and economic constraints that pregnant people experience. I think we need to have, as church, a much bigger conversation about what sacrifices women can and should make for the common good and for their children, and what supports they should be able to expect from the rest of us for making those sacrifices. Until we do, banning abortion undercuts women's moral agency. The supports should come before the sacrifices. As an advocate for reproductive justice feminism, these would be my suggestions for a way forward. Eliminating sexual violence. On a typical day, domestic violence hotlines in the United States receive over 19,000 calls. Globally, 1 in 3 women have been subjected to physical and/or sexual intimate partner violence, or both, at least once in their lifetime. Across justice systems, there are low rates of reporting sexual violence, low rates of prosecution of perpetrators, and insufficient penalties, even when victims take on the life-altering burden of pressing charges against their rapists. Next, we need to foster sexual relationships of mutual flourishing. Sexual relationships should be spaces of mutual care and concern, and we need to avoid or get rid of any scripts within our church that talk about sexuality or gender relationships based on domination or exploitation. Third, accurate information about sexuality. This includes methods of disease prevention, real talk about sexual pleasure as a moral good, and strategies for good communication and an expanded conversation about consent. Purity-based and abstinence-only programs are not the best way forward for our youth and young people who need to develop the tools to think critically about the kinds of situations that they will face in real life. Fourth, we need a robust approach to preventing unwanted or unintended pregnancies. Sexuality education and pre-CANA programs or premarital programs should include information about how to prevent pregnancy, inclusive of contraception, alongside fertility awareness methods that find approval in church teachings. Male responsibility for prevention of pregnancy should be part of this discussion. Fifth, we need to reduce the number of abortions by reducing unintended pregnancies and creating a social fabric of support and hope for women who face unplanned pregnancies. And sixth, locate the right of decision-making in the woman and in her own discernment. We need to reaffirm Catholic teachings on conscience. Catholic teachings say that each person is obliged to follow his or her conscience, and church teachings should help to form one's conscience, but they do not dictate to one's conscience. There's significant overlap between my goals and the goals of the US bishops, but I'm particularly troubled by some of the ways in which some statements by bishops tend to describe fetal life as a higher value than maternal life. Sometimes you will hear the description that embryonic or fetal life is sacred from the moment of conception. Sometimes this can make it sound like once the woman has discerned a pregnancy or once she has seen a positive pregnancy test, she no longer has a choice. In official church teaching, direct sterilization, direct abortion, and direct contraception are morally illicit and are not permitted at Catholic hospitals, no matter the religious identity of the patient or the provider. You may have noticed that the term direct is an important descriptor in these teachings. While there's a complex history to this, it basically is trying to explain the importance of the intent of the act. In Catholic hospitals, the directly intended termination of pregnancy before viability or the directly intended destruction of a viable fetus is never permitted. However, an indirect abortion is morally permissible. Operations, treatments, and medications that have as their direct purpose the cure of a proportionately serious pathological condition of a pregnant woman are permitted when they cannot be safely postponed until the unborn child is viable, even if they will result in the death of the unborn child. So this is sometimes called a non-direct or an indirect abortion. Unfortunately, when politicians or clerical leaders just talk about abortion in the abstract, and especially when they talk about abortion as murder or abortion as intrinsically evil in the abstract, then these important distinctions between direct and indirect abortion are frequently lost. As I noted before, considerable confusion among doctors, lawyers, and clinical ethicists persists in our current legal landscape post-Dobbs. And I think it's not enough to just restate these distinctions between direct and indirect abortion, we need to realize that these have to be applied in particular cases. One of the questions that I have is who determines what cases merit the description of direct versus indirect? One of the challenges that we're seeing is that it's no longer the pregnant patient making that determination. Her voice and her decision-making is no longer central. Other actors are making that determination for her. This is problematic from the perspective of reproductive justice feminism. This is my last slide. I'm going to conclude by saying that Christian discipleship means following in the footsteps of Jesus. A gospel story that I would like to draw your attention to is the story of the bleeding woman who reaches out in a crowd to touch the cloak of Jesus, and she is healed. This is in Mark 5. We do not know her name. We don't know if she was Jewish or Gentile. The text tells us that she had been bleeding for 12 years, and she sought care from many physicians, but her condition only grew worse. You could say that she was exploited by the medical and political establishment in nearing despair. Many women can relate to her today. Today in the United States, more than half of abortions are medication abortions, in which women experience cramping and bleeding, sometimes nausea and dizziness. The worst of those symptoms usually last about 2 days, and sometimes it can last for weeks. As I read this story from Mark's gospel, I think about women experiencing miscarriage or pregnancy loss, inclusive of abortion. I think about them sitting on the toilet, passing blood clots, or lying in bed with a heating pad, and what it might mean to pray for their healing in body, mind, soul, and spirit. In the story, Jesus is in a rush. He's walking in a crowd with his disciples, and the woman reached out to touch his clothes, and he asked, "Who touched me?" And his disciples rebuke him. After all, he's standing in a crowd. But Jesus knew that healing power had left him. Mark tells us that the unnamed woman fell down before him and told him the whole truth. She takes the initiative. She reaches out for healing. She does not ask permission of the disciples first. She does what she knows that she needs to do. She takes responsibility for her healing. The disciples are clueless, as always. Jesus expresses solidarity. Candida Moss says that he bleeds power. In that sense, Jesus bleeds with her. Jesus offers free healthcare, and Jesus listens. She has a voice because Jesus creates space for her to tell her story. And she told him the whole truth. How did Jesus react to this? Did he say how gross it was that her clothes had blood on them, that she smelled? Did he tell her that she was a disgrace to her family? Did he tell her that she needed to sacrifice her life for the good of the community, or that she would be better off dead? Far from it. He said, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Jesus blesses her. Jesus affirms her story. Jesus tells her to go in peace. So here are some questions for us. Will we invite bleeding women to tell us the whole truth about their lives? Will we bleed power in solidarity with them? Will we work to be sure that bleeding women have the health care that they need? no matter what happens in our state legislatures or at the various branches of the federal government, Christians are called to listen to bleeding women and to create spaces for their voices. I hope that we can do that together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. And now I'm going to invite anyone who has a question of either Trisha or Emily to please place it in the chat. Or if you can use the reaction button, raise your hand, or just raise your hand and I'll call upon you. We did have one person in the chat that was asking about the official position of the church, and I was wondering if she got sufficient explanation from the two of you. But she also wondered, same person wondered, what does now Cardinal McElroy feel about your teaching?
So Cardinal McElroy, like others in the California Catholic Conference, has publicly stated that their goal is to advocate for legal protection for unborn life. So there is a difference, I think, in what I framed as reproductive justice feminism and what the California Catholic Conference is proposing as the best way forward.
We did get a question as a wonderment. Do you know of any, either of you know any instances where there is a more pastoral approach to sexuality and the issue of abortion, and where that might be?
Trisha, would you like me to take that one?
Yeah, go for it.
So I think it's variable. I think there are some parishes that do have, for example, grief support groups that are inclusive of pregnancy loss, and other kinds of spaces of support groups or even rituals. For example, there's a range of possibilities to be able to ritualize a loss, and some people find this particularly meaningful in their spiritual journey. That can, take a lot of different kinds of patterns, but we also are starting to see we're also starting to see memorials in some spaces, and so sometimes that means that if a pregnant woman has named her the loss, if she had such a relationship with the fetal remains that she gave it a name, that you might even see names of children who were not born, but who are nonetheless grieved. And I think that it's worth mentioning Project Rachel as a space where some people who have experienced abortion have found spiritual healing. Although there are certainly some that say that Project Rachel has also contributed to shame-based rhetoric. So I don't think it's necessarily a healing space for everyone, but Project Rachel is a retreat that offers post-abortion spiritual support. And I would say it kind of depends on who's on the retreat with you in terms of the kind of language that you might hear at that retreat.
The one thing I would just add in light of that really helpful response is some of the structural realities behind parishes in the United States overall, which is that oftentimes parishes reflect the same sort of inequality that both of us reference. So there's this sort of reifying of lines among those who have and those who don't, and along not only class lines, but racial lines. And so I think part of the challenge for pastoral ministry is to look at the ways in which which parishes are able to forge bridges across difference, and in particular across lines of inequality. And to that, I think there's a role for the diocese to play, because of course a diocese holds many parishes, and those parishes are very different, and people choose different parishes for particular reasons. And so diocesan ministry has the potential to bridge some of those divides in ways that parishes cannot, as they're currently structured.
We got something in the chat that said they wondered, do you see a movement in the bishops moving more toward their focus on ministry toward women and sexuality and whatever, or don't you see that happening in the near future?
I'll share a challenge that I experienced locally, and that is that it's easier to talk about supports than actually providing supports. So, I mean, an obvious example in the parish where I am, we have just blessed a memorial to the innocent unborn, but we don't have free diapers and a diaper changing table in our church. We don't even have a changing table at all in our parish hall. So I think sometimes the messages don't align. For example, when I tried to have a conversation at our St. Rose of Lima family feast, our gathering a couple of weeks ago, about what it would take to start an infant daycare on our campus, then the answers that came right away were, no, it's too expensive, too much liability. There's no way we could do that. And I would just raise up that, like, that's why people are making decisions not to have their babies. They're coming to those same decisions. So if we as a church are coming to the decision that it's just too expensive to take care of infants, imagine what families are going through when they realize that they are facing an unexpected pregnancy. I think the reality is that we could, as an institutional church, offer many more supports than what we offer right now. But there just hasn't been the willpower, because it's just easier not to offer those supports. And I think we need to do that sort of at every level, instead of just even offering flyers for people to go elsewhere. I think it's important for us to think about what more we could be doing.
Emily, I think that's a point well taken. It's frustrating for me that we often focus on collecting diapers or baby food or whatever, baby toys, but we don't think about, as a faith community, what about helping out with daycare? What about helping with babysitting? What about tutoring children? What about all those things? And we don't seem to be able to get there. And I don't know how we're going to get there, but, I think that's where we need to go, so thank you for that. Also, I was just wondering, what would the both of you say as to, I find that church teaching around sexuality is very antiquated. And how do we move that forward? What can we do in our parishes and our communities to really help people understand sexuality and their response to it? So leave that for you.
I can chime in on that to start, which is, given the nature of this group and its history and foundation, of course, it's evolved over time. But one of the studies that I'm currently leading, an interview study, is the National Study of the Catholic Priesthood. And one of the really interesting themes that has come up in that, those confidential interviews with priests, is the challenge around having conversations regarding sexuality. And so I think there's actually an eagerness and an openness there to talk about about sexuality among priests, which I think to the extent that that conversation can start to happen, then it can parlay into conversations around sexuality for the church more broadly, which then are going to overlap with this issue of abortion. So I do take hope from that, and also recognize, of course, that these are in the context of confidential conversation. So what are we not saying, and what are we saying? And so I look forward to ways in which we can sort of shine light on issues that need light.
Thank you. Andrea, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Two things. One was just a comment. I don't know if anyone has seen, but Femme Catholic just published a really interesting study on the number of dioceses that offer paid medical leave. And I think it was like only 4. I just read that within a few weeks, there's been some movement on that from dioceses as kind of like seeing that as almost this scandal expose type thing. So just interesting that sometimes I think just raising attention to those things can make a difference, just as sort of a comment. But the other question was, it was mentioned still trying to make abortion rare. I guess one thing that I see in talking with folks who identify as quote pro-choice, although we know there's a lot of nuance there, a movement towards that it doesn't need to be rare, that even all of these difficult situations that were brought up about finances and about race and the challenges, like that those don't need to be centered, because at the end of the day, it should just be like a woman's choice, and if it's convenient or not. So I just have sort of questions for either of you about, do you see challenges with the rhetoric moving in that direction for some folks, or how to engage? How does the church engage with that? How do you see that? Not sure if that question makes sense.
Emily, go ahead.
I really appreciate the question, Andrea. I building off of Trisha's advice to avoid some of those labels that can be misleading. I have tried to avoid the labels of pro-life and pro-choice in my work more recently, and it's hard, but it's helpful, I think. But I have critiques for both. And I do find that reproductive justice is a framework that is able to push against both, sort of the simplistic understanding of choice that is narrowed to convenience, and that restricts an understanding of sexuality to be only about consent and not about meaning or about mutual relationships. So I want to push back against an element of the rhetoric that we hear in the choice community that I think doesn't really encapsulate the fullness of what sexual justice looks like in healthy relationships. At the same time that I want to push against what I see as sort of an overly simplistic understanding of a pro-life approach that doesn't always understand the constraints that people experience when they're trying to make these difficult discernments, and that too often privileges fetal life above maternal life, and doesn't really recognize the inherent conflict. So I think reproductive justice is a framework that sees inherent value in both lives, and that wants to develop a structure in which women have healthy sexual relationships. So there's a lot about prevention in there. But then once she finds herself in a situation of either a tragic complication or an unwanted pregnancy, there's still more agency that is given to the woman, or that is empowering of the woman. So I think the reproductive justice framework doesn't minimize the inherent value of fetal life. Instead, it wants to create a social system where we have healthy pregnancies and where children have everything that they need to thrive. But that also means being welcomed into a space where they will be able to be cared for.
We have another element in our chat. Many people say that the Dobbs decision of Supreme Court is essentially about denying women's agency over their reproduction and little to do with being pro-life. What do you think of this? And I would add, many of us have embraced the seamless garment, and we don't see that evident in many of the conversations, the dialogue. Yeah, it's primary abortion, but forgets about all the other elements of life. So what do the two of you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the words that Emily raised early on in her presentation was patriarchy. And I think it's sort of important to recognize the context in which we build and understand laws and the way that plays out both in our society and in the church. And I think part of the challenge behind this is that we lack an ability and understanding to talk about the world in structural terms. It's much easier to talk about it in terms of individuals and also to talk about it in terms of symbolic values. And that's why things like labels are easier, and phrases like, well, we love babies, we don't want abortion, abortion is murder. There's sort of quick phrases that enable us to uphold certain values without actually unpacking what's behind them. And I think that's where it gets troubling when around this language around even making abortions more rare, because if we look empirically, abortions have actually been declining. The rates of abortions have been declining in recent years. And yet now we see this very, forceful sort of legal change, which is symbolic as much as it is practical, that is flipping the script during a time when abortions were actually going down. So I do think that both on a legal landscape and in the ways that the bishops talk about this issue and the ways that we understand this issue, we need better language and understanding that pushes us behind this sort of agency individualism that Americans are really good at, because we get it and we like these stories, pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, but beginning to recognize that the reality presents some things that are very different for many people, that challenges that require structural solutions.
Well, we've come to our time, but first off, we did have a person once again ask if the two of you have gotten any pushback from the institutional church, especially as you've been publishing.
I get lots of feedback across the spectrum. I'm sure that there are some invitations that will never come because of what I'm saying, but then I think there are other invitations that will keep coming. So I'm sure I will continue to get some pushback, but feedback in general is what I'm looking for. My perspectives are continuing to evolve as I hear from folks about their own experiences. So I'm very open to feedback.
Great, that's a beautiful response. And I lean on trying to say what is true. And sometimes truth is troubling, but it doesn't make it untrue. And so that is my guide more than anything else in the work that I do in this realm and others.
I want to give each of you then a minute to give a concluding remark as you wish.
Well, I'll conclude very briefly with thanks to all of you for coming tonight and for being willing to sit in some discomfort with a really complex question. My encouragement to all of you, which is something I'm trying to take up for myself as well, is to continue to seek common ground on some of these action items that don't need to be so divisive. I think that abortion will continue to be something that dominates headlines, and people will use abortion in order to create divisions, but church could be a space for us to come together across those divisions and actually work on ways of assisting vulnerable people. And so I hope that we can work on some of those things together, and it might look differently in different places, but my goal would be that we would at least try to do that work, that really pragmatic work together.
say that the Catholic Church is uniquely positioned in the United States to help facilitate and foster some of these conversations, even just in a structural resource organizational way. The church is in every state, and the experience and reality of abortion now looks pretty different across different states, but the Catholic Church has a means of being able to foster conversations, and difficult ones at that. And I think it's not something that can be avoided or oversimplified. It does require perhaps some discomfort, perhaps some creative thinking, and some willingness to use candor and educate oneself a little bit to be able to build, as Emily said, common ground. I do remain optimistic in this moment, and perhaps even more than ever, in the sense that people are talking about it. This is something that is on the radar, and this is a moment that can be capitalized in the sense that here's a chance to actually engage this and think about what does it mean to really support women, men, families, children. What does it look like, and what does it take? So thank you all for also helping to foster that conversation.
Thank you so much.